Hey everyone, RK Bentley here, coming to you with my very first video blog. For those of you who don't know me, I've been a Christian apologist and a blogger for, I've been blogging for about 12 years now. I've been doing apologetics online for maybe 20 years or so. But things are just getting busy. I'm working 2 jobs now to try to make ends meet. You know how that goes. And I'm just, don't have time to blog like I used to. And I thought, you know what, since I'm spend a lot of time on the road, I thought, why don't I just start a YouTube blog? So here I am. If you want to read any of my posts that I've written on my blog, you can visit my blog at rkbentley.blogspot.com. I'm going to put that link in the description of this video. So stop over there. I've got about, over 1,000 posts I've written over there. You're welcome to stop and read some of those. And if you're new, go ahead, please subscribe to my channel. Click the notification bell. Share it on your social media. Try to help me build this channel. I really, really appreciate it. If you have something you want me to talk about, just go ahead and leave a comment. If you have something you disagree with about, I really want you to leave a comment, because those are the people I'm trying to really reach with my points here. I want to try to just kind of talk to the skeptics a little bit, okay? So if you have something you disagree with about, please, please, please leave a comment, and maybe I will be able to get back with you. Maybe use your comments for future videos. Okay. So I was trying to decide what to make my first video about. And I had a post I had written on my blog a couple years ago that was, it was received kind of well. It had a few thousand visitors. I don't know, maybe 10,000, I don't know. But it was pretty well read. And it was called 5 Arguments for the Existence of God. So, I try to make short videos, and I try to make short posts. But sometimes even, a couple of typewritten pages are, kind of long. It's kind of hard to remember all that. But I thought, I need some just bullet points that people can use if they're talking about God. And what are some of the 5 easiest, simplest arguments to remember? I tried to come up with an acronym to help people remember these 5 points, and I really couldn't think of anything creative. So if you can think of one, just leave a comment and make a suggestion, okay? I'd really appreciate it. But if you just learn these 5 points, you'll find that when you're having discussions with unbelievers or critics or skeptics, they will go a long way. Okay, so just learn these 5 points, maybe study them a little deeper than the time I'm going to talk about them now, and you'll have a little toolbox already that you can use when you're discussing Christianity with non-believers, okay? So, let's go and get started, okay? 5 quick arguments for the existence of God, okay? So, argument number 1 is the existence of matter and energy. There's a principle in science. You might have learned this in school. You might have heard it described this way, that matter or energy is neither created nor destroyed. It can only change forms. So you can burn a log, for example, and make heat. And in that case, you're converting matter into energy, but the total amount of matter and energy remains constant. You're not creating new energy, you're just converting that matter into energy. You can also convert energy into matter. It's a little bit more difficult of a process, but it can be done. But the point remains the same. The amount of matter and energy in the universe is constant. There's no new matter. There's no new energy. There's nothing coming into the universe from outside of the universe. And you can't create more than what you already have. Okay? If I have a certain amount of energy, I can only use that amount of energy. I can't use that energy to create more energy on top of it. Okay? Something like that would be considered perpetual motion, which is really impossible. But this all begs the question, if there's no new matter and energy, and if matter and energy exist, where did it all come from in the first place? Right? If there's none being created, where did it all get created in the first place? Now, some people say, well, there has to be a natural explanation, but that's kind of ridiculous because something logically can't create itself, right? So if you say there's a natural explanation for nature, that's like saying nature created nature. It really doesn't make any sense. It had to have been created by something outside of nature, something beyond nature, something supernatural. Something supernatural by definition. Something outside of the universe had to create the universe. That's really the only thing that makes any sense. So that is my first argument for the existence of God, is the existence of the origin of matter and energy. So the second argument is the origin of life. You know, once upon a time, people believed in a thing called spontaneous generation. They believed that you could take non-living matter, and just in certain circumstances, living things would come out of that matter. A famous example was how maggots seemed to just appear in rotting meat. So they thought that was an example of spontaneous generation, where the maggots would come out of the meat. And there were many examples of this, maybe hundreds, but certainly dozens. And that was believed for a very long time. Well, people got to experimenting a little bit on this, and they began to discover that in every single example of what they believed was spontaneous generation, the life was actually coming from some other living thing. In the case of maggots, for example, they came from eggs being laid by flies on the meat. So they didn't just appear in the meat, they appeared from the flies that laid eggs on the meat. And one by one, every single example of spontaneous generation they believed was occurring really wasn't occurring. And in all of our time of looking, we've never found an example of life coming from non-living things. It's never happened. Not one time ever have we ever observed this. And we've also tried to do it. We've tried to create life in a laboratory. And in decades and decades and decades of trying, we've not come anywhere close to making life in a laboratory. So life just doesn't happen. It doesn't rise spontaneously by itself. We can't even create life in a lab. But yet there are living things. Where do they all come from? Well, again, if life doesn't rise by itself, and if we can't create it by our own means, then it had to be created by some superhuman or supernatural means. So I believe the origin of life, or the existence of life, is evidence that there is a supernatural creator. So that's number 2. Number 3 is the existence of absolute morality. Now, there are some things that you know are wrong, okay? You know deep down this is wrong. But what makes anything wrong? What makes it right? How do we define what's right and what's wrong, okay? You can look up the definition, but all the definitions kind of suffer from a little flaw. They say, well, it's to do something injurious, something unfair, unjust, or whatever like that. But I thought, well, why is it wrong to injure somebody? Why is it wrong to be unfair? It still doesn't tell you why it's wrong. And I heard Dinesh D'Souza one time in a video. He says, look, wrong means that it's not the way it ought to be. But to say that something is not the way it ought to be suggests that there is a way it ought to be. There should be an objective way it ought to be. Well, in a universe without a God, the universe doesn't care what happens, okay? There's no way things ought to be. There's only the way things are. And we can have preferences, but the preference is merely that. It's just our preference. And we might want things one way, and somebody else in another time in another place want things a different way. So we could say, for example, it's wrong to own slaves. But if you go back 150 years ago and ask some of the slaveholders in the South, they might say there's nothing wrong with owning slaves. So what makes us right and them wrong? So you see, a universe without a God doesn't care what happens. There is no way things ought to be. There's only the way things are. But as a Christian, I know that God created the universe. The Bible tells us he made the universe in 6 days, and then he looked at everything created and said, behold, it was all very good. See, God made things the way they ought to be. He said, this is the way it ought to be. This is the way I want it to be. And when it's not that way, it's wrong. See, wrong can only exist, evil can only exist in a universe where there's a God. In a universe without a God, there's no such thing as evil. There's no such thing as right and wrong. So if you believe that there is a such thing as right or wrong, that can only happen in a universe where there's a God. So that is the third argument for the existence of God. The fourth argument is the historical certainty of Jesus Christ. You know, if you pick any character from history and try to prove that he lived or he existed, and you try to do it scientifically, you'll find out that's really not possible. Okay, that's just not the way science works. If I tried to find out if Washington really crossed the Delaware, for example, how could I do that? I couldn't go study the river. I couldn't go watch a video of him traveling across the river, okay? The only way I know that it happened is that somebody wrote it down. People wrote down what happened, and we have those records, and that's how we know that Washington crossed the Delaware. And that's how it is with any person, especially when you go back 2,000 years. That's how it is of any person. Pick any other person of antiquity, Socrates or Plato or Aristotle or Alexander the Great or Julius Caesar or Hannibal or Kublai Khan, anybody, I don't care who they are. If you tried to prove they existed, the only thing you could do is try to find things that people wrote down about them. But here's the truth. Other people have such small attestation in written documents. If you take somebody like Alexander the Great, for example, I mean, everybody's certain there was an Alexander the Great, but the things we have written about Alexander the Great, the earliest manuscripts we have are from 400 and 500 years after he lived. So we don't have any documents from the time he lived. We don't have any documents for the first 100 years, the second 100 years, the third 100 years, the fourth 100 years, okay? And then the earliest documents we have just a handful, just a couple of manuscripts that talk about Alexander the Great. And that's the way that it is. And that's the way it is with everybody. But when it comes to Jesus of the New Testament, we have what some have called an embarrassment of riches. We have thousands of manuscripts. Some of them can be dated to within decades of the time that Jesus lived. We have thousands of manuscripts in Greek. We have thousands more in Latin, and then more still in early languages like Coptic. Then we have the quotes of the early church fathers, okay, who wrote about that. And they would quote scriptures, and they would talk about these things. And we have maybe 1 million citations from the early church fathers. Okay? We have more documentation of the life of Jesus, of the deeds that he did, of the miracles that he'd done, of his life and his death and his resurrection. We have more evidence for that than we have of any other person in history by far. By far, it's not even close. So we have eyewitness accounts of people who saw Jesus alive, who heard his teaching, who saw his miracles, who saw him alive, saw him die, and then saw him alive again. And we have the unimpeached testimony of his teachings, of his resurrection. And we can be as certain of that as we can of any person in history. And so that's the fourth argument that I used for the existence of God. Now the fifth one is a little bit in reverse here. We're going to shift gears here, okay? My fifth argument for the existence of God is what I like to call the lack of evidence to the contrary, okay? Now see, I can run down all these 4 examples that I've just given you, and some skeptic will just sit back and shake his head and says, that's not evidence, that's not enough, I'm not convinced. And that's fine, he could say that. But he doesn't have an argument to the contrary. He doesn't have anything to rebut it or refute it. All he can do is just refuse to believe it. So let me give you an example for the first one. The existence of matter and energy. So let's say my friend and I are traveling through the woods and we come across a cabin. And it's just a crude cabin, just 4 walls and a door cut out. And that's it. Dirt floor, everything else, that's all it is. And I might say, you know, I wonder who built this cabin. I wonder where he is now. I wonder how long ago he built it. Okay, these are things that we might ask. But my friend says, you know, I don't think anyone built this cabin. I don't think this cabin had a builder. And, you know, I'm kind of shocked, you know, and I think, well, somebody had to build it. He goes, no, I don't think anybody had to build it. I think it could be built by nothing. Well, see, my friend, if he's going to have me believe him, or if he's going to have me not believe that the cabin had a builder, he's going to have to convince me, one, that nothing can build something, and that, two, that his explanation is the more reasonable or the more likely than my explanation. You see, believing the cabin had a builder is a reasonable belief. Believing that matter had a supernatural origin is a reasonable belief. And if he's going to try to dissuade me from what is the most reasonable belief, he's going to have to give me an alternative explanation, and he's going to have to convince me that his is more reasonable than mine. And then in the case of the origin of the universe, they have no other explanation. They can only sit there cross-armed and say, nope, I don't believe it. Well, that's fine. You're welcome to not believe it. But that's not an argument. That's not a reason for me not to believe something that I think is very reasonable, that there was a supernatural creator of the universe. You see, so the lack of evidence to the contrary. And this applies to all the points. The origin of life. You know, once upon a time, we believed in spontaneous generation, but now they still believe in spontaneous generation, only they call it abiogenesis. You know, so they say, well, the first life form formed a certain way. And they'll tell you they don't believe in spontaneous generation, but they still believe that abiogenesis happened, which is simply a different name for it. I don't know what else they could call it, except the belief that life came from non-living matter, and you're not calling it spontaneous generation, you're calling it abiogenesis, which doesn't make any sense. They want me to believe an idea that was discarded about the same time as bloodletting. Okay? Why? Why should I believe an idea that we have studied and studied and studied and found that it just doesn't happen? And you still cling to it, and you have no example. You have no example, you have no credible theory, you have no way of saying this is how it happened. You just say that God didn't do it. See, it's not reasonable. You have no evidence to the contrary. The existence of absolute morality. You know, they can say, well, our right or wrong is simply an evolved trait. We just have, humans evolved to have empathy. We have, this and that. And look, that's fine. They can say that if they want, okay? But at the same time, they really have no way to say that anything is absolutely right or wrong. They can say, because I've heard some people say, well, it's wrong to teach your children, to make your children be Christians, or to teach your children about God. That's just wrong. I think, well, why is it wrong? You think it's wrong. I don't think it's wrong. And you don't have any standard by which you can appeal besides your own opinion. You have no other argument except that you prefer that I not do it. You see, you have no argument to the contrary. And of course, the historical certainty of Jesus. I've heard people say, well, the Bible has been corrupted, the Bible has been copied and recopied, we don't have any original manuscripts, all we have are copies of copies that have been translated and translated and translated, and we really have no idea what the original said. Well, that's a very poor description of, the scriptures that we have. We don't have translations of translations of translations. We have translations made from manuscripts that were copies in the original language is what we have. So if you try to say they're corrupted, okay, what did the original say? How do you know they're corrupted if you have no idea what the original said? We do have manuscripts in the original language, and I can compare the translations we use now to the original language, and I can see that they're very credible. And if you're trying to tell me that they're corrupted, well, you're going to have to show me evidence that they've been corrupted. I need something besides your flapping gums. I need something saying why I should believe something when I can look at the original manuscripts and read them for myself. You see, you have no evidence to back up your claim that they've all been corrupted. You just merely say they're corrupted. Okay? So there's the arguments: the existence of life, the existence of the universe, the existence of absolute morality, the historical certainty of Jesus, and the lack of arguments to the contrary, the lack of evidence to the contrary. Those are the 5 quick points I use for the existence of God. Has this gone 20 minutes? But there you go. So I appreciate everybody stopping in and visiting. Please come back and leave a comment below. Like I said, share this video, subscribe to this video. Just help me build this channel, okay? I really appreciate it. Y'all have a great one, okay? Check back soon. Thanks.